Good day. My name is Sonja Leverkus. I work in the Wildfire Analytics Lab at the University of Alberta, and I own and operate Shifting Mosaics Consulting and Northern Fireworks. It's a real honor to be speaking to you today from Fort Nelson in Treaty 8 traditional territory, where we share the land with Kaska, Dene, Cree, and Deneza people. Today I'm going to provide a quick introduction to myself, some of my thoughts on fuel structure, and welcome an invited guest and colleague of mine, John Davies. I have a PhD from Oklahoma State University. Go Pokes! I am a registered professional biologist, professional agrologist, registered professional biologist in British Columbia, and I'm a certified wildland fire practitioner with the Association for Fire Ecology. I also work with BC Wildfire Service as an ignition specialist and as a crew leader and danger tree assessor on my Type 3 wildland fire suppression crew. From 2006 until 2012, I was the range agrologist and 10 years forester for the Fort Nelson Forest District, approximately 10 million hectares or 11% of British Columbia, where I really cut my teeth and learned a lot about prescribed fire. Over the last few years, I started my own company, Shifting Mosaics Consulting and Northern Fireworks, finished my PhD, and recently in 2018, I became an adjunct professor at the University of Alberta, working with Dr. Jen Beverly and Dr. Mike Flanagan. With our company, Northern Fireworks, we're very much a boots on the ground company, even though we do feel that we can lead and influence fire in Canada from higher strategic levels and science. We also find that it's very important to combine that with time spent on the fire line, in the black, and with one hand on a dragon. We do a lot of training with Northern Fireworks, and every year for the last 5 years, we've been hosting and teaching and delivering fire schools across British Columbia. Apart from our training, we also have an excellent chainsaw crew. We do fuel treatment and fire smart home ignition zone assessments. We have recently completed some slashing jobs. We have our Type 3 suppression crew, and we're also a full service prescribed fire planning, operational, and research company. I was asked, how does fuel structure inform what I do and what I look for and what my recommendations and implications could be? For me, fuel structure is a very complex thought. Also for me, fuels are not just about things that we burn, but they're also forage and browse for wildlife and a lot of livestock. Fuels are vegetation. And here in the Boreal, we know that it's a pyrogenic landscape, driven by fire, and that this fire creates shifting mosaics through space and time, and those shifting mosaics result in heterogeneity. So heterogeneity is the differences in vertical structure, distribution, and composition of vegetation or fuels, and that has been successfully argued in the scientific literature as the critical root of biological diversity. And when I talk about prescribed fire, I'm talking about the application of fire on the land through the use of a prescription, which outlines treatment, specific goals, and management objectives and distribution of fire through space and through time. Fuel structure is an important component of prescribed fire because it also drives the operational application of how we're going to put fire on the land, whether it's from the ground or from the air, and that's often dictated by the fuel structure and how safe it is for our crews. In addition, fuel structure is also what we want to look at and work back from when we're doing our prescribed fire burn planning. So we look at what we want to achieve on the landscape and we work back from that. Ecologically, for me, fuel structure is also about post-fire effects. We know that the whole landscape is not going to be black and burned forever. From my research, from my PhD, we know that there's resprouting species and much vegetation and a giant flush of vegetation that comes back in. So that vegetation is browse and forage for wildlife, but it's also fuel for future fires. It's important to also discuss pyroherbivory, which is herbivory driven by fire. And in my opinion, this also represents fuel structure that's driven by this ecological process of fire and grazing. This range reference area excludes large mammalian herbivores from inside of the fence, which shows that herbivores are actually dominating the fuel and the vegetation structure of this landscape, much like it's been seen across the world. Species, there are many species that have a very strong interaction with recent fire on the landscape. So with shorter fuel structure, we would more relate to an O1A and an O1B fuel type. These animals include wood bison and mountain goat and thin horned sheep. And I feel it's important that we acknowledge that this interaction between wildlife and fuel being foraged, with that interaction, there is also an interaction with the time since fire, so the length of time since fire was last applied to that land or received on that landscape, and the number of times it has been burned historically. We also see this strong interaction between ungulates and recent fire in elk. Moose perhaps require a longer time since fire, or maybe a different type of vertical structure or fuel structure on the landscape, maybe perhaps 2 to 5 years or more since the fire last occurred. And caribou, in a similar way, potentially they need 30 to 35 to 40 years since the fire. So again, a different type of vegetation and type of fuel structure across the landscape. I bring this all forward so that we are aware that we're not just talking about one type of fuel structure or one type of vegetation, that I believe we need to be thinking about multiple different types of fuel structure and distribution across the landscape to meet ecological objectives. When I think about what we need to have in order to be successful in various different types of fuels and fuel structure across the province, across Canada, across the continent, there's all of the planning and the different types of equipment that we need to have in order to be prepared to have a safe and successful operation in that different type of fuel structure. When I think about fuel structure from an ignitions perspective, I think about containment and how much effort is needed to box in our fire, what we need to be doing for our black lining, how aggressive we need to be, and what the fuel structure is in our black lines, in our containments, and what that looks like. And hopefully at the end of that, we can have a nice box that we can then safely and effectively burn inside of. Fuels and emergency management, in my opinion, is less ecological, and my experience is less ecological and much more focused on consumption and reaching the objectives of removing fuel ahead of a fire before it comes. A couple of examples of ignition operations that were completed in 2017 for the Elephant Hill fire. There's a lot of things that make me go, when worlds collide, just like with this black bear and this wood bison on the side of the Alaska Highway grazing together. I do wonder about fuel loading and fuel treatment. And I am new to this world of thinking in the tons per hectare. This past year have had the opportunity to work with the Burns Lake Community Forest and the very creative work that they're doing to reach these objectives that have been identified by government for surface fuel loading. In my mind, ecologically, operationally, economically, I'm wondering how much testing has been done on the surface fuel loading, if this is appropriate to do in all ecological settings, and what the effects are when we actually do see a fire coming into these areas. This is my name, phone number, email, all of our contacts. I thank you very much for your time today, and it's a great pleasure to introduce you to my good friend, John Davies, registered professional forester from Southern British Columbia, who I will now pass the mic over to. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is John Davies. I'm a registered professional forester specializing in wildfire management, and I own a company, Frontline Operations Group, that does specifically this. I've been a past forest firefighter, and I've been a consulting forester in this field since 2004. It is my passion. It's what I love to do. I have been provided with a couple questions from Sonja to answer here. The first one being, how does fuel structure inform what you do for fuel treatment and fire smart? And the quick answer is absolutely everything. If we are going to manage wildfire behavior and reduce its impact, as well as try and manage fuel, then we really need to measure it. And we need to know all aspects of it, from its structure to its fuel loading. And if we're going to engage prescribed burning, then we're also going to need to understand fuel moisture content of it prior to ignition in the planning phase. So we use line transects to collect fuel loading data within these stands for surface fuel. And then we use standard surveying methods for collecting overstory data, and then put those two things together so that we can come up with appropriate prescriptions for mitigating wildfire risk and abating fuel hazards to try and come with some post-treatment conditions that are appropriate, ecologically appropriate for the site, and balance all the values on the site with wildfire behavior reduction objectives. And second question I've been provided is, what are the recommendations, implications for consideration of fuel structure in fuel treatment? And I believe I've mostly answered that as well. Again, we need to have an understanding of what is out within these stands as far as surface fuel loading, so that we can come up with appropriate treatment methods and objectives and fuel loading targets. And so often we end up dealing with two different fuel size classes because a lot of the work that we do is funded by the BC Wildfire Service, and they have some very specific criteria that they require. So we're generally dealing with fuel loading in the class less than 7 centimeters in diameter and above 7 centimeters. And the role of that material that's less than 7 centimeters in diameter is primarily associated with the potential rate of spread that can occur on that site if a fire were to ignite within it or to move into it. And so what we're really looking to do is to reduce that fuel loading less than 7 centimeters to such that it has a very low intensity and a low rate of spread, and provides a safe environment for firefighters to anchor their suppression tactics from. And when we're dealing with the fuel class that's greater than 7 centimeters, we're looking to reduce fire severity and mop-up issues. This larger material can sit and smolder for extended periods, and that can lead to soil sterility and hydrophobic soils, etc. So we look to reduce that to a more ecologically appropriate level, something that you might historically find within the stand if we were allowing fire to play its natural role in the ecosystem. Where we can start to run into challenges with this fuel loading reduction is when we start to remove too much of it, and we can have an impact on its role that it plays within the ecosystem, which can be range from everything from habitat for the larger material to soil protection and water retention in the duff for that smaller material. And as well, both of these fuel classes also provide nutrients to the site over time, which has some pretty significant importance in these dry forest ecosystems. So if we're going to learn, try to manage fire behavior within a stand, we need to be able to address and understand the fuel structure that's out there, so that we can provide appropriate recommendations for meeting our objectives.